Thank you, and we will commence in a hurry because we are running a little bit late. So it's very fitting that we continue our explorations of the 16th century with the next speaker, Professor Michael Kover, and it's also very fitting that he follows on Greg Sterling, since Michael did his doctoral work with Greg at the University of Notre Dame. Now he is an assistant professor in the theology department at Marquette University in Milwaukee on Lake Michigan in the United States. But this year he is spending the entire academic year in Münster as a Alexander von Humboldt Fellow. Michael has published various works on Philo already, and we look forward to his paper now when he speaks about the next step in the publication of Philo's treatises. Professor Michael Kover.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me? Microphone working? Thank you also. Is that working? Yeah. Thank you also to the organizers, to Frédéric and to Smaranda for inviting me to give this paper. As I said to them at the time, I am not an expert in the 16th century, and I look forward again to learning. A word about the handout. I have given you a handout with transcriptions of Turnèbe's preface and the preface of one of his successors, in a certain way one of his successors, David Hoeschel. And I give you the texts and translations with a certain amount of fear and trembling, because they're rough translations and I'm working on them, and so I would appreciate if you see errors or can think of improvements, please send them to me. And there are a couple of questions about the text itself as I was transcribing them that I have. I give you those as a small gift, and you can perhaps help me. And then there are some final pictures on the back, so I hope you enjoy the handout. Paris and Augsburg Revisited, David Hoeschel, Bürgerhumanismus, and the ecumenical completion of Turnèbe's Philo. The publication of Adrien Turnèbe's 1552 Editio Princeps of Philo has long been celebrated as a major moment in the history of scholarship. David Runia has called it the first reasonably complete modern edition of the works of Philo. Beneath that phrase, reasonably complete, however, lies a story about what was missing from Turnèbe's edition, in addition to some other treatises about which we've heard this morning, 3 treatises from Philo's allegorical commentary, and how the Augsburg Lutheran humanist David Hoeschel set about to complete, or if one prefers a more Philonic word, to perfect, the edition of his Gallican Catholic colleague. Just how it came about that Turnèbe did not include these 3 treatises, owing to the fact that they were not in the manuscripts in his possession in Paris, and how Hoeschel published them 20 years after Turnèbe's death with Sigmund Feierabend in Frankfurt, or as Nick Hardy tells me, maybe just under the impress of Frankfurt. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were published in Frankfurt, I guess, but I'm learning, is in itself a story worth telling. So, part 1, between Paris and Augsburg, the separation and reunification of the Corpus Philonicum. Turnèbe's first edition was made with the use of at least 3 manuscripts, Paracinus Graecus 433, 434, and 435. Despite their simultaneous numbering, all 3 manuscripts have slightly different contents. Turnèbe's principal manuscript was, for his edition, was Paracinus Graecus 433. This he supplemented with readings from the other 2, as well as emendations from conjecture, as Greg mentioned. All 3 manuscripts, as Turnèbe indicates in his preface, were at hand in the Royal Library of Fontainebleau. How did these 3 manuscripts come to the Royal Library? I don't know, but I'm going to make a guess. Given that Paracinus Graecus 434 was an Italian copy of Philo, and that Paracinus 433 was copied by Nicholas Sophianus, a Greek from Corfu, with close connections to the printing houses in Venice, it seems at least possible that these two manuscripts, and perhaps all three, were part of a sale by Antonius Epicurus of some 300 manuscripts written in Corfu to the Royal Library of Francois I in the early 16th century. Especially intriguing in this connection is the fact, pointed out by Marcus Hoeschel, that while many of the Eparchian manuscripts were sold to the French Royal Library as early as 1529, a portion were also purchased by the city of Augsburg in 1543-44. Here we catch a first glimpse of the relationship between these two humanist Hauptstädte, Paris and Augsburg, gleaned from the history of manuscripts. As we will see, it is likely, or possible at least, that one of the Stadt Augsburg's acquisitions was a manuscript codex called Augustinus, later Monacensis Graecus 459, in which David Hoeschel, the Lutheran praeceptor classicus at the Santa Anna Gymnasium, would discover the three treatises missing from Turnèbe's Editio Princeps of Philo, and these are De Mutatione Nominum, that Turnèbe publishes, De Mutatione Nominum, the second book of the Legum Allegoriae, and the second book of De Somnis. Augsburg. Adrian Turnèbe had been dead for over 20 years when David Hoeschel, not yet rector of the Santa Anna Gymnasium in Augsburg, in his early 30s, published his Philonis Judei Apostolatriae in 1587. Herein were included three treatises missing from Turnèbe's 1552 edition, but present in Monacensis Graecus 459. De Mutatione Nominum had been completely lacking from the Historica, and its premier place in Hoeschel's edition reflects not only its placement in his codex, but also his assessment that this text will be of greatest interest to humanist friends and civic patrons. Moot is followed by the first edition of two books belonging to treatises that Turnèbe had partially already published, Legum Allegoriae II and De Somnis II. Now there can be no doubt that in crafting this diminutive volume, three Philonic opuscula, rather than opera, followed not by notes, but notatiunculi, at least I detect, maybe I don't know enough about humanist Latin, that Hoeschel has labored under what literary critic Harold Bloom has called the anxiety of influence. Hoeschel claims explicitly that he is a newbie, or in Latin, a tiro. The phrase is me tirone et in hunc arenum modo descendenti, me, a newbie just now descending into this arena. And in his preface, he begs forgiveness for any errors. What Hoeschel's Apostolatriae lacked in volume, however, he only gets to publish 3 Philonic works as opposed to Turnèbe, it possessed in scholarly industriousness. And as our Augsburger David faced Turnèbe's Gallican Goliath, he clearly sought ways not only to complete Turnèbe's work, but also to compete with his scholarly legacy. Thus, Hoeschel published not only 3 new treatises, he also appended marginal references to biblical quotations. What Greg noted Turnèbe is maybe doing in the manuscript, Hoeschel writes out in the margins the actual biblical lemmas, and you can see that in the back of the handout. He wrote a series then of independent notes on each of these 3 treatises. If Turnèbe had given the world its first modern addition to Philo, Hoeschel could boast of offering the world the first modern commentary on Philo's Greek texts. Hoeschel's composition of the Apostolatriae offers several windows into the early reception of the Turnèbe edition, which have implications not only for the history of humanistic scholarship and the book, but also for the ecumenical importance of Philo as a common authority among moderate 16th century humanists of differing confessions. In what follows, I will treat Hoeschel's relationship to Turnèbe from 3 angles. I will begin with a close reading of Turnèbe's and Hoeschel's prefaces, analyzing the different portraits of Philo that emerge in each work. I will second look at Hoeschel's marginal notes in Monacensis Graecus 459, which we have, to illustrate the process of discovery and reception via the history of these manuscripts. I will close by offering a brief summary of Hoeschel's commentary method by looking at a page of his Notatiunculi on De Mutatione Nominum. And these are all examples of this, are all included in your handout. From these three concentric studies, a picture will emerge of the synergy between the humanistic efforts of Paris and Augsburg, which transcend confessions and, as Turnèbe states, especially of his own Paris, extended benefits of largesse, euergesia, and intellectual freedom, e eleutherias paideia, not only to the French humanists, but to foreign scholars of all stripes, quote, from nearly the entire earth, who reside in the museums of this cosmopolis. It was as part of this war of paideia against barbarity and ignorance, rather than the interconfessional struggles of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, that the Catholic Turnèbe and the Lutheran Hoeschel labored shoulder to shoulder in friendly ecumenical competition. Let us begin with Turnèbe. Part 2, a tale of two prefaces. Turnèbe's preface, Philo as Apostle of Renaissance Humanism. Turnèbe's Greek dedicatory preface to the first edition of Philo, addressed to Charles, the humanist cardinal of Rohan, is written in an elegant, classicizing, though not atticizing, prose. It is a masterpiece of this genre, popular among Renaissance humanists, although admittedly I have not read too many of these. According to John Lewis, Philo would have been important for Turnèbe on account of his mixture of scripture and philosophy. But what I would like to highlight here is a more subtle and understated allusion to the Philonic corpus in Turnèbe's preface, which Greg has already mentioned and which I think provides the key to understanding his reception of Philo. In the preface, Turnèbe construes Philo first and foremost not as a theologian, but as a proto-humanist, someone who, despite his theological and philosophical acumen, had carved out a place for liberal paideia and the progymnasmata. Put another way, Philo's most important treatise for Turnèbe is not the Legum Allegoriae, nor the De Vita Contemplativa, but De Congressu Eruditionis Gratia, what Posen called that little treatise that, despite possessing little of the eloquence and spirituality which brightens most of Philo's others, has a special interest of its own. Turnèbe's portrait of Philo the proto-humanist emerges in the first part of the preface. There, Turnèbe is describing the malaise of his time, which might be summed up in the single word barbaria. He apparently levels this charge at the more rigidly dogmatic thinkers of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, including perhaps the Jesuits and the ultramontanist theologians at the Sorbonne, as well as perhaps better-funded Italian humanists like Cosimo Bartoli, whose close connections to the papacy had encouraged warlike political ambitions and the hawking of scholarly wares. I'm not entirely sure about Bartoli, and there's a Greek note here that needs to be followed up on that we can in questions if you'd like. In contradistinction to these models, Turnèbe construes the more moderate humanist Charles as an erastes tes eleutheriu paideias, a lover of liberal paideia from the time he was in his swaddling clothes. In a subsequent passage, Turnèbe then goes on to personify liberal paideia as a woman, saved by the gracious beneficence of Charles, and the passage bears quoting in full. I believe this is on the first page of the preface translation. Right about the time of the Homeric quotation about Homer's Aphrodite. For in our land, nearly everyone was measuring what is wise for the sake of making money and turning a profit, not, by God, honoring what fills the kneading trough with barley, to speak in a comic fashion, but being zealous for what gilds the coffers, thinking that city-destroying, money-making art of Bartoli's coinage, which is all golden even more than Homer's Aphrodite, alone to be wisdom, and leading her in honor just now, they were conspiratorially preparing to drive out liberal education, bringing against her the accusation of guilt, that she would destroy innovation, receiving in her place the victorious manner of law that had been banished by holy ordinances. Although so far this had not yet happened, all wretched paideia, he panathlios paideia, was about to flee headlong outside the territories, or be carried there in funeral procession if you had not ordered you, Charles, if you had not ordered her, who was already despairing of herself, to take courage, extending her your saving right hand of fellowship. End quotation. Turnebe's imagery of the relationship between wisdom and liberal paideia echoes classical texts by Homer and the tragedians. But given the context of Turnebe's preface, one cannot fail, I think, also to hear, in the joint figures of ruling wisdom and slighted fleeing all wretched paideia, echoes of Philo's famous allegory of Sarah as wisdom and Hagar as the preliminary studies. Sadly, in his own country, Turnèbe laments, those who represent the ruling wisdom are behaving less like Sarah and more like Creon. In that image of the Panatheos thrown out of the city, I think we see here echoes of the Antigone cycle as well. So the ruling wisdom or theology is behaving in France less like Sarah, more like Creon, ready to expel all alternative forms of learning from their civic gates, because they are not lucrative or dogmatic enough. Turnèbe is thus pleading for a more lenient reception of the slave woman, liberal paideia, modeled on such passages as De Congressu 13 and 14. Greg cited De Congressu 79. I want to cite another passage that I think also reflects the way that Turnèbe is using this Philonic exemplar. And I'm sorry that I don't have this printed on the handout. Philo says in De Congressu 13 and 14, now we may feel profound admiration for the discretion shown by Sophia. She refrains from reproaching us with our backwardness or complete ignorance in generation, though, as the text truly stated, it was through our unfitness that she was not bearing children, and thus, and not because she grudged us offspring. Thus, wisdom says, go then to my handmaid, the middle paideia, given by the intermediate branches of school knowledge, so that you may have children from her. So I think there is this complex intertextual work that Turnèbe is doing with De Congressu. Important also, though, for this depiction of the wisdom and middle paideia is Paul's letter to the Galatians. And you see in this section of the preface that Turnèbe has construed Charles as extending the right hand of fellowship to liberal education, much as those in Jerusalem extended Paul the right hand of fellowship in Galatians, welcoming back in the humanist part of the story. I don't have time to read the entire paragraph, but I've noted in the footnotes potential allusions to Galatians. And it's not an accident, I think, that Galatians is the place where Paul does his Sarah and Hagar allegory. None of this was lost on Turnèbe. Turnèbe thus receives Philo not merely as a recondite author of general theological interest, but also as the first-century apostle of moderate Gallican Catholic humanism. Philo's allegorical defense of the propaideia is taken as a foreground of the Catholic humanist championing of the liberal arts and sciences and speculative theological liberty, in opposition to a less lettered scholasticism. It is critical to note here that unlike some other post-Tridentine Catholic receptions of Philo, which use the Alexandrian Jew as a fulcrum against the Lutheran and Reformed critiques of monasticism, that Turnèbe here deploys Philo as an ally in an intra-Catholic war between Gallican Catholics and Ultramontanist or Papalist factions. Turnèbe, siding with the local French side of this divide, and his dedication of his edition of Philo to a local French cardinal, is an indication that his scholarship, like his ecclesiology, was informed by Renaissance civic humanism, with its high valuation of the principle of subsidiarity. This last point links the works of Turnèbe with the so-called Bürgerhumanismus of David Hoeschel, librarian and classicist at the Santa Anna Gymnasium in Augsburg, to whose dedicatory preface we now turn. So, Hoeschel's preface and portrait of Philo, Philo the physician, and a mnemosynon to Turnèbe. As noted above, Hoeschel's opusculatria is haunted by a French humanist anxiety. as its author labored long in the shadow of Turnèbe. This anxiety of scholarly belatedness is nowhere more evident than in Hoeschel's decision to write the dedicatory preface of his edition of Philo in Latin rather than in Greek. Here, Hoeschel clearly gives the laurel to Turnèbe, refusing to compete in Greek, and pays homage to the master. Of course, Hoeschel's decision to write in Latin may reflect as much the education of his Augsburg patrons as his scholarly anxieties. Hoeschel, however, has not only written in Latin, but has also peppered his preface with little Greek phrases. And I understand from Joanna Weinberg this is fairly common, so caveat what I'm about to say against that. Hoeschel, these represent, I would like to suggest, a kind of coded discourse with humanist eavesdroppers, most especially the ghost of Adrien Turnèbe. In his Latin-Greek bilingualism, Hoeschel not only praises and emulates, but also competes with Turnèbe. Fashioning himself as a kind of German Cicero, who could write bilingually, Hoeschel translates the French Catholic Platonism of Turnèbe into the register of his own ecumenical German Lutheranism. We find a prime example of this in Hoeschel's opening lines. Hoeschel begins his preface with a clear note of dependence on Turnèbe. As Turnèbe opened with a simile about a river, so Hoeschel opens with a simile describing Philo as a therapeutic potion maker. Turnèbe applies this same imagery in the middle of his preface, describing how Philo managed to blend the best of theology and philosophy, recognizing them not as enemies, but in truth as sisters. As Turnèbe writes, Philo mixes what is, in our eyes, the most beautiful and sweetest wine, and, so to speak, a potion out of both sciences, at the same time Hellenizing and Judaizing, doing philosophy and doing theology. Greg and I have slightly different translations, but you'll recognize the passage. For receiving the Platonic muse as a servant of theology, he admits her within the adytum, while on the other hand he drives out what is blameworthy from the other philosophers as unfit for such great mysteries, forcing them outside the lustral chambers, unless perhaps for the sake of seasoning and taste. Like salt, he sprinkles in also some minor elements from those other philosophical sects. I'm sure some here want to dispute that claim. So well aimed and on the mark is his use of Platonic thought that it is a common parable that either Plato Philonizes or Philo Platonizes. That was Turnèbe. Hoeschel's Latin preface begins with an allusion to this passage, but then turns the imagery in a different direction. He writes, that custom which doctors practice, intending to the sickness of children, how they choose rather shining potions, and mask them with sweet juices, by which they may more easily induce children to consume their medicines. This same practice in the care of the soul, our most reverend author Philo Hebreus has imitated with a certain admirable artifice. With these words, Hoeschel both echoes Turnèbe's metaphor of Philo as drink mixer or potion maker and turns it on its head. Whereas for the Catholic Turnèbe, Philo mixes the fully adult, even Bacchic concoction of philosophy and theology, intended for advanced mystical initiates. The Lutheran Hoeschel suggests that Philo's mixture is rather one intended not for mature adults, but for immature children, those not yet ready to receive the unadorned medicine of the literal sense of Scripture, we might guess. Philo and Plato, thus, do not in truth mean the same thing for Hoeschel. Rather, Plato and philosophy are a superficial sweetness added by Philo to lure the immature mind away from its youthful way of thinking toward a more mature theology of the Hebraica Veritas. As proof of this affinity, Hoeschel seasons his argument, in a first Greek citation, with a text from Plato's Timaeus. Hoi Hellenes aides esi, the Greeks are always children. The double reference to this text, first in Greek and then in Latin, indicates that Hoeschel is speaking on two fronts. It's like the Gospel of John and others, he translates the language that he doesn't think people may be able to read. First to his fellow Hellenophone humanists, and second to his less well-educated civic patrons. Hoeschel's Greek phrase, taken from Timaeus 22b4, O solon, solon, Hellenes ae pades este, suggests that those who have found in Philo's words a robust defensive allegory have succumbed to the form rather than the soul of Philonic thought. Just as Plato in the Timaeus uses myth to allure youthful thinkers into the likely account, so Philo, according to Hoeschel, employs a kind of philosophical myth-making of his own, exclusively for the purpose of the moral improvement of his readers. As Hoeschel goes on to note, Greeks determine that nothing is right unless it has its origin in their own writings, so that they may have cause either of extolling their own monuments or of disparaging the best written works of others. With this fact in mind, so that he might moderate their infirmity, Philo did not render the meaning of Holy Scripture kata to rheton, but rehearsed its meaning kath kuponoion, in a certain allegorical fashion, in a Greek manner, so that his doctrines might seem not at all different from the sum of their philosophy, which renders appetite obedient to reason, and with the brute part of the mind thus pacified, bids the human being return to being as godlike as possible. Here Hoeschel couples his citation of the Timaeus with an allusion to the Theaetetus to demonstrate that what Philo takes from Plato is, above all, his ethical psychagogy. Stepping back for a moment from this close reading, a clear distinction between these two 16th century editors of Philo emerges. Whereas Turnèbe draws on De Congressu Eruditionis Gratia and Galatians to fashion an image of Philo the allegorist and apostle of humanist propaideia, Hoeschel uses the Legum Allegoriae and 1 Corinthians, this language of developing out of your status as a napios, is an allusion to 1 Corinthians in Hoeschel. Hoeschel depicts Philo as the doctor to immature Greek thinkers, rendering the literal sense of the text more palatable. In addition to their differing assessments of Philo's allegorical project, several further differences in Turnèbe's and Hoeschel's reception of Philo can be noted, which bring into sharper relief their dissenting portraits of the Alexandrians' importance between Paris and Augsburg. Second, and we've talked a little bit about this, but I'll just say it as it stands, the Catholic Turnèbe's Philo remains Philo Judaeus, and in the Greek, Philo the Judaizer. Any dogmatic faults seem to be forgiven Philo for the sake of his very real allegorical and theological successes. And I quote Turnèbe, "If Philo receives many thoughts differently than some are accustomed to allow, if his exegesis is not through and through blameless, but if he misses the truth, if in his allegories he entertains ideas which are rather strange or unbelievable, there is much room for pardon. For it is not easy to keep everything straight in any event, and especially in the Holy Scriptures that excel the human mind. It is better then to love Philo, agapeteo. It is better to love Philo for the things that he interpreted well and on target than to blame him for those points on which he did not precisely hit the mark." Hoeschel's Philo, by contrast, is Philo Hebraeus, Philo the Hebrew, whose medicinal dissimulation of the Lutheran Hebrew truth with Hellenizing honey is coupled with his probable conversion to Christianity by Peter and Mark. After that momentous meeting in Rome, Hoeschel tells us, and then with Mark in Alexandria, Philo surely began to think differently about a great number of things. Insofar as Philo's erstwhile Judaism remains expressed in his writings, Hoeschel indicates that he has documented some of Philo's Jewish or other errors and corrected them with support from the Old Testament in his Notatiunculae. And I have an example of just one such correction in the handout. He further defends his publication of Philo on the basis of their reception by numerous church fathers, a point which Turnèbe, at least in the preface, finally hardly finds necessary to mention. A third and final point of Lutheran emphasis in Hoeschel's portrait of Philo, which I will just briefly mention, is Hoeschel's remarkable emphasis on the role of divine grace in the Corpus Philonicum. Here, Hoeschel anticipates the observations of many contemporary scholars, among them John M.G. Barclay, who in his recent book, Paul and the Gift, points out the importance of grace and divine assistance in Philo's soteriology as well. Hoeschel is clear that Philo preached salvation not by mental wrestling alone, and that no one escapes the land of the body without divine assistance. How am I doing on time, David?
Keep on going.
Okay. All right. So it may be concluded from these 3 points of contrast that Hoeschel sought, in his dedicatory preface to his Augsburg civic patrons, to craft a Philo more appropriate for an ecumenical Augsburg than a Gallican Catholic Paris. Nonetheless, one finds in Hoeschel's penultimate Greek phrase what can only be a final nod of gratitude to Turnèbe for beginning the momentous work which he has now endeavored to complete. In offering a word of thanks to his patron, oddly in the singular, Hoeschel ostensibly thanks the civic owners of the Philo manuscript. These owners, it seems, are the dual vos, the duum viri, to whom he has dedicated the preface, while Hoeschel thus offers his tria opuscula as a kind of denkmal of a grateful mind to Recklinger and Welser. His use of the Greek word mnemosumon cannot fail to recall Turnèbe's words to his own patron, Charles. Kai nun marturion tiautes kai mnemesumon tes Philonas ektosin soi prosphono. He who is silent cries out. Hoeschel, I think, while echoing Turnèbe's phrase down to the indefinite article, is speaking in a kind of double entendre, remembering both his own civic patrons, but also simultaneously adding a note of praise posthumously for his appreciation to Philo's first modern editor. Okay, the last 2 sections I will go through rather quickly, and these apply to, in your handout, you'll see first some portraits or pictures of Monacensis Graecis 459, and then some facsimiles of Hoeschel's Notatiunculae. And I will just offer brief comments on both of these. In keeping with this colloque's approach via the history of the book, I offer these final 2 sections a look at Hoeschel's editorial and commentary work. We may first turn to Appendix 3. One of the most remarkable aspects of studying Hoeschel's reception of Philo is that we have not only his edition, but his handwritten notes in the margins of the Codex, which allowed him to complete Turnèbe's edition with these 3 missing treatises. Image 1 shows the title and incipit of De Mutatione Nominum, as Hoeschel would have first described it. The crosses on either side comport with Hoeschel's adoption of the Philo-Christianus legend, if those are crosses. Image 2 and 3 show Hoeschel's text-critical work. He would mark errors in the text with an asterisk and write conjectures in the margins. The emendation in image 3 from De Somnis 2 was one Hoeschel was especially proud of and mentions in his preface, and Conan Wendland adopts. In image 4, we see Hoeschel's cataloging of Philo's biblical references, a practice which he only observes in De Somnis 2. I didn't find it in Leg 2 or in De Mutatione Nominum. He would later incorporate this task into his Notatiunculae. Finally, image 5a presents a rather intriguing poetic note found above De Mutatione Nominum 31. The note is curious for a number of reasons, and here I'm really wading out into the deep end, folks, so please help me out. I've transcribed it to the best of my ability as follows, and I'm working with the scan from the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, so it's got some limitations. But to me it appears to read, Allophilos lian leris, enthare hos caenalis, which I've translated, but friend, you are too silly here, in this place, as also elsewhere. The note is roughly iambic and rhymes with the final syllables of each line are italicized. When each line are edicized. As 5c shows, this is only one of several editorial asides in Codex Monacensis Graecis 459, where a scribe appears to write a note, perhaps to Philo, using the vocative. In light of the comparative handwriting analysis, it seems unlikely to me that the note in Mut 31 was penned by Hoeschel. It may well come from an earlier Byzantine scribe. Had Hoeschel seen it? This is an intriguing possibility, as this is the same locus at which Hoeschel carries out his promise to correct Philonic theological errors. In Mut 31, Philo's error, according to Hoeschel, is to suggest that the souls which cannot receive both good and bad impressions may appear to be, quote, the craftsmanship of others, and not of the one God. If this is what the scribal verse comments on, it's strikingly light-hearted in comparison with Hoeschel's more austere correction of Philo in the Notatiunculi, and reflects more Turnèbe's attitude towards Philo's failures than that of his Augsburg successor. Finally, the first modern commentary on Philo's Greek text, Hoeschel's Notatiunculi, briefly. As Hoeschel says in his preface, he sets out, one, and these are illustrated in the parallel columns, to present parallel loci in the corpus Philonicum, at which Philo transmits something similar or illuminating. Two, to compile early Christian Nachleben of Philo's ideas. Three, to identify and correct Philonic errors. And four, to amend the text of Philo via gathering manuscript evidence and scholarly conjecture. There's also a very interesting instance of where Hoeschel goes across Turnèbe's edition and finds elements of Philo's potential Trinitarian structure in his theology. And I'll just close with this note that Hoeschel is, all these page numbers are to Turnèbe. So we have here a very important chapter in the reception of Turnèbe and its constructive advancement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for that fascinating exploration of the interaction between the first two editors of Philo's Greek works. And I think you are understandably tentative in certain areas because there is so much here to explore. Frédéric, how much time do we have for questions?
20 minutes.
Oh, that's quite a lot of time. Fortunately, that clock is still labouring under summertime, I think. So, Greg, you'd like to start?
Yes, Michael, thank you very much. It's a very fine paper. So one footnote and then my question. So the footnote is the other work that he doesn't have is De Posteritate Tiny.
Yes.
And that, I think, is not discovered until later in a different manuscript. But they don't have that. So you might just want to make a note of that.
Yeah, I'm actually, can I go get a pen so I can make a note of that?
Yeah. So my question is this. I completely agree that he's using De Congresu, that Turnèbe is using De Congresu and alluding to it. But my question is, do you think that that's really... why does he translate De Vita Moses rather than De Congresu 2 years later? What is it that leads him to translate that text? Do you think things change, or you make this very central to Turnèbe? Yeah. It is clearly in the preface, but I'm not sure it's quite as central to Turnèbe, but that's my question.
That's good. That's a great question, and I don't have a studied answer to that. I think it may, I mean, one reason might be that Turnèbe intuited that the life of Moses is a better text to make accessible first. In other words, this may go back to the Greek versus Latin readers question. The polemic context, I think, in publishing the whole edition, it's too good a jab, I think, to not use Sarah and Hagar and to weave it into Paul's polemic against the Petrine faction. So likening the folks at the Sorbonne to the Petrine faction, that's a Reformation critique, and he's using it. So I think it may have something to do with readership. And I'll say this also about Turnèbe. When I looked at his ordering of the treatises, what I noticed, and you're right that he doesn't have this threefold pattern, three commentary series, but he always puts the exposition first. So he puts Opificio Mundi at the beginning of the Cosmopoetica, or the Cosmica, whichever it is. He puts De Abrahamo at the beginning of the Historica, and then he adds De on Joseph right before De Somnis. So I don't know. I think it seems like he had some sense that these works were more introductory, and from maybe that's why he went with the Vita Moses, because he thought, why begin with the allegorical commentary? That's the problem.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the bioi, he recognizes each bios as a type of introduction, and he uses it that way to frame the specific treatises, and he's using the sequence of the biblical text and using them as an introduction to what follows.
That's right, but I think there's also, this is interesting, there's also a sense that maybe you're progressing as you move through, right? So he's kind of recognizing the heightened register of the allegorical commentary, and because he construes Philo as such a Platonist, there's a clear teleology from the exposition backwards into the allegorical commentary. I would think that comports well with his portrait of Philo Platonistum. That's very interesting to think about. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Francesca Calabi. So just wait for the microphone.
I have another question, but about the Vita Moses, the translation of the Vita Moses. I don't know, but I wonder whether there are also philosophical, theological reasons for translating the Vita Moses before than other works. I mean, not only textual reasons, philological reasons, but also philosophical. I say that because I saw that the first translations in Italian are translations of the Vita Moses. And if we look at those translations, we see that there are a De Opificio, a De Iosefo, and two or maybe three, it's not clear, De Vita Moses, which was the first one to be translated. And there, in that case in particular, it's certainly a question of, let's say, political, theological reasons. Moses is the law, Moses is the prince, Moses is many things. So about your particular question, I'm wondering if the reasons are not just the reasons of textual reasons, I mean, but theological and philosophical reasons. Besides that, I have another question. I don't know if I may ask now. It is about the parallel you make about the two similes, how to say it in English, I don't know. The river and the sweet juices. Now, when you spoke about them, I had something in the back of my mind, because the simile of the river recalls me Isaiah. The river, which is the springs of Paideia, which go as a river, as a strong river everywhere. And probably, maybe that Turnèbe has this in mind, speaking of Paideia, the river of Isaiah. While speaking of Hoeschel, the sweet juices, I don't know, maybe I'm saying silly things, but just a Lucretius, where we have the sweetness of the poetry, so that people can accept the asperity of Epicurean philosophy. And there we are speaking, Lucretius is speaking of children who drink the sweet juices for accepting the asperity of Epicurean philosophy. So, I'm wondering if the difference you put between the auditory of adults and the auditory of children is not somehow already in the sources. If these are the sources, maybe they aren't, I don't know. I'm just putting this. But what I was asking and wondering is, Hoeschel, if I did understand it, doesn't speak of Platonic philosophy and theology, but he's speaking of allegory and literality. So maybe there is a little gap, I don't know, I'm asking if there is.
A gap between the usage of the similes. Yeah, I think that, first of all, thank you. I think the Lucretius allusion is almost certainly right. And it is interesting that Hoeschel is combining it with the Chinese. This is really, really clever stuff. And I was so impressed by the quality of both of these prefaces that I began to think I was the Barbaria problem, because these are very, very smart. So I think you're right about Lucretius, and you're also right. I have to go back and look closely at the text. I mean, we could do this now, or we could do this in the interim and look at exactly what is being likened, how the potion metaphor is being used in both cases. It's possible maybe that Hoeschel is more open to the Philosophia Christi that was being pursued by humanists of various countries at this time, and that I'm allowing myself to be duped by the shared simile. But there are a number of things. I didn't see, the drink is almost Bacchic in Turnèbe, right? It is, to tap into Philonic language, it's the drink of the initiates. I don't see that being the kind of potion that Hoeschel is talking about. So it may actually be a level, and again, I would have to go back and read the text more closely than I can right here. It may actually be an element of Hoeschel's competition with Turnèbe to turn this aspect of the simile on its head as well. I could be totally wrong. I see Carlos Levi wants to.
Yes, just a word about the rivers and the mountain.
Can we get a microphone?
Thank you.
Just a word about the simile, the metaphor of the rivers and the mountain. It is a Ciceronian one that you'll find in De Oratore 369 in another context, but the metaphor is the same, and that's not strange in Turnèbe,
So Turnèbe is now the Greek Cicero. I love it. I told you I'm Barbaria. I'm such a barbarian when it comes to. Thank you, Carlos. That's fantastic.
Giovanni, please. The microphone.
About Turnèbe's prefatio and his presentation of Philo as a humanist, as a symbol of agreement between studio maniora of the Italian humanistic tradition and theology. Turnèbe publishes his edition of Philo at the beginning of the 50s, when France is in the way of falling into civil war between, or already fallen into civil war between Catholics and Huguenots. And the 50s are also a period of a great suspension in the works of the council, the Catholic Council, which will be completed in Trento only in, I think, 1564, 1 year before Turnèbe's death. So this prefatio dedicated to a French cardinal with these ideas probably Turnèbe is presenting himself as someone still dreaming a solution along a humanistic agreement, some sort of Melantonian agreement with the Lutherans, a bit in the tradition of Erasmus and Guillaume Boudet.
Yeah.
I think there is something like that.
Thank you very much. Yes, and he does mention, I can't go more deeply into this because I don't know enough. I was talking with Nick about it, but he talks about this Sophia that's so worshipped by the ruling party in France as polyporphum, as city destroying. And there's some recollection of wars going on. I don't know if partially it's wars elsewhere that this is clearly just below the surface of this is the whole political content, but I thank you for that, and I think the intra-tridentine nature of the preface is something that I could take into account of as sort of the molten lava that's forming still in this Catholic discourse, which is really, really exciting. Thank you.
Great.
So just to add to this, when Turnèbe dies in 1565, there's a fairly significant controversy that breaks out about his own religious identity. And it's because he insisted he be buried simply, without any rites, and he did not take the last rites. There were over 600 tributes to Turnèbe when he died. I mean, that's how significant he was. And there were Protestants claiming he was a Protestant, and Catholics claiming absolutely not.
Like Erasmus.
Yes, that's exactly right. But I think he's a lot like Erasmus in his own inclinations, and he was trying to hold things together. The last thing I'll say about, just to add one more footnote to De Vita Moses, there are 39 manuscripts that include De Vita Moses, and while there's no clear pattern that places in terms of where it's placed unambiguously, the one pattern that's discernible is they tend to place it first. At least a number of the families either place it first or place it at the beginning of what we later call the exposition of the law. So they do recognize it has an introductory quality.
So, if I may ask the last question. Oh no. Please. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for your rich expose. Maybe a few ideas. Of course, I just read the text, if I may help. In a general way, the Turnèbe's preface could be compared to Guillaume Boudet preface to Commentari Lingue Greche, where he asked the king for a royal college of arts, and he uses the words like museum. And
what was
others.
it? Buddha's
Commentari Lingue Greche.
Okay.
The preface.
Yep.
It's a Greek preface, so it's written Greek too.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether the Ekeinen ten Bartolikou Komatos Grammatisticen Polyportos
Help me.
could be linked to Bartolo di Sassoferrato, the medieval legal scholar, interpreter.
Okay.
I don't know Bartolo's work very precisely, but he was like the first medieval legal scholar to invent the notion of copyright, for instance.
Okay.
And maybe Grammatisticen Polyporton could be linked to the Aristotle theory, where he distinguishes the ecumenical, which is good for the house economy, and Grammatistiki, which is like infinite and greed and enrichment. So could be in this way, could be Polyporto.
Okay.
But
Yeah, so
a tentative, it could go back to Aristotle.
Yeah. Can I let me expose my ignorance. I think that's very helpful. I did come across this figure. I opted for Cosimo Bartoli, which was a suggestion to me from a colleague who studies this period, in part because of the wars in Florence at this time. And it's a contemporary, something that's happening in the same century. There's actually wars going on. the rise of the Medici family and all that. And so it seemed to me that if I were Turnèbe, I would draw on a contemporary political analogy to vivify the dangers of what might happen to France. But I'm not, again, I'm way out of my depth here. So I would like to hear more about particularly this break.
Yes, yeah, of course, just trying to give. And for Welgikes, Fantastes Welgikes Polis, maybe it's a strange way of spelling Belgian, Belgikes, but I don't know. We should see what were the wars of King Henry.
Yeah, that's right.
That could be Belgian.
Belgium, okay. Ah, yeah. That would actually make some sense. Yeah.
Because there is hesitations in beta and OU, like in David.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know. It's strange. We should have a beta.
It's possible that it's possible that I mistranscribed that one. So I'd have to look. I'd want to look
City of
back.
Belgium could make sense.
Thank you.
Based on history.
Thank you.
And just a final. I think the Lucretius allusion to Lucretius could be interesting, but I thought about the thing of man being like a child could be related to the first letter to Corinthians, chapter 13.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
In fact, I've noted that. I think that he's, again, like a master literary scholar, he's woven 1 Corinthians together with the Legum Allegoriae. And probably Lucretius to paint this.
And St. Paul was a Jew.
Right. Yeah.
Not for him, though. He was a Christian.
Not for Hoeschel. Not for Hoeschel. Everybody's a Christian for Hoeschel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we still have time for one more?
Yeah, please.
I just want to use the expertise of all the manuscript and early book scholars here, and I'm interested in the first picture from the manuscript on page 9. And am I right in saying that between the two crosses we have the title of the work?
That's it, yep.
So is that a convention in manuscripts to do that? To place a title between? No. So Michael had a theory that it might point to a Christian background. Does anyone have a theory on that?
The cross is used in many ways, or not many ways, but several ways.
Yeah.
It's very often used as a kind of indication for a correction at the margin. I mean, so it's very difficult to make it into a Christian kind of thing. There is, let's say, indication, let's say, as a kind of indicating the title, so that there's so many manuscripts. I've never seen it.
Right. You've never seen it, though?
No. Yes? Yes? Yeah.
Well, looking at the images of the manuscript online, I guess from the fact that it's a black and white image, but I guess from the fact that there are different colour variations that some of it may well be written in red ink.
Yeah, that's what I said. It's a rubric, yeah.
No, it's not a rubric. It could well be it would be a titling, but...
What's interesting is he actually goes on to include not just the title, but also the first line of the commentary, also in that red. And that I don't know why that is either.
Well,
if you can help me read my little poem and have any thoughts about this little editorial poem, I'm really interested in this, but I need a better scan to read the second one. But I'd love to talk with you in the interim about that.
well, I think we bring the session to a close, and let us thank once again our speakers for a very, very interesting beginning to our conference.
Thank you.